There are more than 22,000 IP addresses that we have detected, internet addresses, that correspond to computer systems within the United States. Now, one of the large research projects that we have underway is how many of those systems are attack systems that are used to relay and pass attacks from the CIA out into the rest of the world, and how many of those are intermediary victims, that is, say, an internet service provider which is hacked in order to create an attack somewhere else, overseas, and how many are direct victims, how many correspond to, say, a visitor to the United States from a foreign country, how many correspond to joint operations between the CIA and FBI, with the CIA providing technical support, etc. So it's a complex question that is not yet resolved, but there are more than 22,000 IP addresses corresponding to CIA activities in the United States. A question, is there proof that the CIA are involved in internal struggle, leaking as opposed to something else? Well, we can't comment directly on sourcing. As someone who's studied the behavior for many years of intelligence agencies in different countries, it is an unusual time in the United States to see an intelligence agency so prominently involved in domestic politics. Now, as a sort of level of principle, that's quite problematic. There are arguments on the other side that obviously if there's an extreme government, then perhaps that does call for illegal behavior by an intelligence agency. We don't have an opinion on whether that is the case yet or not in the United States. WikiLeaks is, I guess, intellectually intrigued to see this conflict occurring because it does tend to generate whistleblowers and sources on both sides of the equation. What are the implications for journalists and their sources? Well, I explained previously, these types of attack technology are used to penetrate the computers and phones that journalists use to communicate with each other and to communicate and protect their sources. I think that's an incredible problem. In response to the Edward Snowden disclosures and some others, much more encryption has been used by individual companies specializing in it, like Whisper Systems and like Telegram, but also included into Apple and Microsoft and other products. So that is fairly effective at hindering bulk interception, which is what the National Security Agency's been doing, passively taking all the information, say, that flows from Latin America to North America or from North America to Europe. But in response, the Central Intelligence Agency, at least, has diversified to specialize on attacking the endpoints prior to encryption occurring or after decryption occurring. And you say, okay, but that at least means that they have to engage in targeted attacks, which is more expensive and might have more of a audit trail. That's true, but we have exposed a particular section of the Central Intelligence Agency called the Automated Implant Branch. So that is not just to develop viruses and other attacks to put into people's computer systems to facilitate a CIA hacker in doing that, but also to automate how that is done. So you can see that between an individual targeted attack, which is direct and invasive, and massive passive bulk interception, there's an intermediary point, which is the increasing automation of targeted attacks. They're automated enough, they start to approach the level of bulk passive interception. We're not there yet for most countries, but we are shifting significantly away from one CIA officer directing one hacker who attacks one target. Rather, we're seeing systems developed and whole branches of the Central Intelligence Agency to automate attacks and infestations of CIA malware into targets. How do these practices by the CIA impact on members of the general public? Android phones, iPhones, Samsung TVs, etc. Well, in a number of ways. So you might think, as a member of the kind of average person, well, is the CIA interested in you? We have this problem that increasing automation of these attacks means that the interest may not have to be that high. You might know someone who knows someone who, say, works for the French government, who will be the target of such an attack because they're involved in decision-making about large French exports. And we published a previous document showing how the ODNI, that's the oversight body for all intelligence agencies, instructed the CIA to try and get hold of every single French contract valued at over $200 million. Similarly, in the information we revealed about CIA attacks on the French political parties, there was 2 instructions to try and determine whether French political parties would try and go for a more German-oriented economic policy of increasing exports. Now, presumably what's going on is that the Central Intelligence Agency and the ODNI, through who they tend to be involved in contracting, is close to organizations, say, like Boeing, and then wants to assist Boeing in unfair competition, say, against Airbus, which the French have a stake in. The question about redactions. WikiLeaks has often stated that it only redacts in exceptional cases. Well, there's been a lot of false reportage about what our redaction policy is. Our redaction policy is essentially the same as the Freedom of Information Act, which is we don't redact unless there are important grounds to do so, and then we only do so for a limited period of time until those important grounds have elapsed. In this particular case, we redacted some 78,000 pieces of information for Vault 7 Part 1. That information corresponds, as I said before, to IP addresses of targets and attack machines. Well, why did we redact that? Well, because we're in this we want to investigate which ones are targets, which ones are attack machines, which ones were victims that were attacked to get a placehold to make another attack. And if we publish them all immediately, it'll be harder to create that investigation. What is the time period that these publications relate to? The time period is 2013 to 2016 for the Part 1 publication that we published on Tuesday. Other material in Vault 7 is also recent, and there is some older material. Interestingly, one of the key systems, attack systems developed by the Central Intelligence Agency, which affects multiple computer types at once, is called Hive. And if you look carefully, you will see that in our publications on Tuesday, there's a reference to Hive being first started more than a decade ago. So the CIA has been involved in this for quite a long period of time, gradually expanding its capacity as it managed to get budgetary and political preeminence over its chief bureaucratic and budgetary rival, the National Security Agency. So that's a very interesting story about the conflict between these two rival agencies over time, with a CIA budget that used to be smaller than the national security budget and is now something like 1.5 times the size of the national security budget. As a result, the CIA has been able to build its own drone air force and massively expand its hacking operation, so it doesn't need to ask the National Security Agency for favors. And of course, if you ask someone for a favor can be asked back, but also a lot of the operations that the CIA conducts are a bit questionable. For example, that operation conducted against the Senate Intelligence Committee. Now, if the CIA had no capacity of its own, it would have had to ask the National Security Agency to provide it with hackers to help it attack and try and take those CIA documents off Dianne Feinstein and her staff. Now, it wasn't able to, it didn't need to disclose that to the National Security Agency because it had the capacities to do it itself. And the National Security Agency, having been in the so prominent, especially after the Edward Snowden publications in 2013, has far more oversight and accountability for its digital operations than the Central Intelligence Agency does. It's a real question whether in practice there can be meaningful oversight. I don't think there can be. I think it's an illusion that there can be meaningful oversight, although one has to try, because you can't leave a regulatory ground unoccupied, because it will simply, the bureaucratic organization will simply expand into that regulatory ground and occupy it. So why can't the CIA's hacking operations be effectively regulated? Well, they're done in secret. It's arcane, complex technology. And look what has happened with the CIA loss of control over its entire cyber weapons arsenal. So if the CIA, which is certainly is highly motivated to try and keep control of its cyber weapons arsenal, if it can't even control its entire cyber weapons arsenal because information can flow without oversight, then what is the chance that it can control how that arsenal is used? It can't. There's absolutely nothing to stop a random CIA officer or contractor or liaison agent working for the British using that technology against whoever they like, for whatever personal reasons they like. The technology is designed to be unaccountable. It's designed to be untraceable. It's designed to hide itself. It's designed to remove traces of its activity. It's designed to throw off people looking to see where there are fingerprints that might demonstrate who authored that technology. And that is done by collecting viruses and malware from mafia and various groups in other states and assembling them. That's something that we published, that there's a whole section of the CIA working on something called Umbrage, which is designed to do that. And we have quite a lot more material that talks about these attempts to throw off to throw off attribution, to discover who was really behind a particular cyber attack. Already, an antivirus expert has come forward to say that a sophisticated malware that he had attributed to a state, either Iran, China, or Russia, now he believes actually is from a Central Intelligence Agency, because the type of attack system it uses corresponds directly to a description that we published of that attack system, and it's rare enough that it seems unlikely it would be independently discovered. Unless, of course, that China has already gotten hold of these parts of the CIA arsenal, and that China is using them to pretend to be the CIA. Is the CIA causing commercial damage to companies through these practices? Yes, potentially billions of dollars of damage. Because if say you're in China, which is now the world's largest economy, and you run a company and you want to equip all your employees with particular phones or particular computers, do you trust that if you go and buy a Dell computer or a computer running Microsoft or an Apple phone, can you trust that it's not vulnerable to these CIA attacks? Well, because Apple and Dell and so on are all based in the United States, when it's understood that the US government is breaching previous promises that it has made, which is to tell US industry about these vulnerabilities, then it starts to look like that the US government and US industry is in cahoots. And then you can't trust any exports from the United States. So one report just at the time of the Edward Snowden revelations suggested that that practice by the National Security Agency of imperiling US industry would cost $40 billion in exports. So this sort of behavior by the Central Intelligence Agency, undermining those commitments by the Barack Obama administration to tell US technology companies about vulnerabilities before they were exploited by foreign intelligence agencies or by cyber mafia, that breach of promise decreases trust both in the US government but also in US exports.